Victoria Hayes was the kind of woman people couldn't help but notice. With her striking red hair, piercing green eyes, and a magnetic charm that could disarm even the most guarded heart, she seemed to glide through life effortlessly. On the surface, she had it all: grace, confidence, and a sharp wit that made her the center of every room she entered. But what most people didn't know was that Victoria had a secret. A dangerous, tangled secret. She wasn't just seeing one man. She was juggling two. And neither of them had the slightest idea about the other. It had all started innocently enough, or so Victoria told herself. There was Ben, a kind, dependable architect with a boyish grin and a heart full of dreams. He adored her, showering her with gifts and attention that made her feel like the most cherished woman in the world. Ben was the kind of man any woman would be lucky to marry, and Victoria often wondered why she couldn't just settle for him. But then there was Ethan. Ethan was the opposite of Ben in every way: dark, brooding, and unpredictable. A musician with a rebellious streak and a passion that burned like wildfire. With Ethan, Victoria felt alive in a way she couldn't describe. Their connection was electric, and every moment with him felt like stepping into a storm. He made her heart race and her pulse pound, and she was addicted to the chaos he brought into her life. Two men, two worlds, and Victoria at the center of it all, balancing on a knife's edge. Victoria met Ben 3 years ago at a friend's wedding. He had spilled champagne on her dress and, horrified, spent the rest of the evening apologizing and trying to make it up to her. His sincerity had won her over, and their relationship grew steadily from there. Ben was thoughtful and steady, a rock in the swirling tide of her life. "Vic, I booked us a weekend in the Berkshires," Ben said one evening, flashing her that boyish smile. "I thought it'd be nice to get away, just the two of us. What do you think?" Victoria smiled and leaned into him, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "That sounds perfect, Ben," she purred, even as her mind wandered to Ethan. Ben had no idea that she'd spent the previous night in Ethan's cramped apartment, listening to him play guitar until dawn. Ethan had swept into Victoria's life like a hurricane. They met at a smoky jazz club downtown, where he was playing lead guitar in a local band. She was drawn to his intensity, the way he seemed to live and breathe music. It didn't take long for their connection to ignite into something fiery and consuming. "Where were you last night?" Ethan asked one afternoon, his voice low and accusing as he lit a cigarette. "I told you, I was working late," Victoria replied, her tone breezy. She was good at lying, and she'd had plenty of practice. Ethan squinted at her through the haze of smoke, suspicion flickering in his dark eyes. "You're always working late," he muttered, but he didn't press the issue. Victoria knew how to distract him. She leaned in, brushing her lips against his neck, and just like that, the tension melted away. To keep her double life intact, Victoria had developed a system. Ben was her daytime companion, the man she introduced to friends and family, the one who fit neatly into her polished, respectable image. Ethan was her midnight escape, her guilty pleasure. She kept her phone locked with a fingerprint scan and a backup passcode that neither man could guess. She planned her days meticulously, ensuring that her time with one never overlapped with the other. But cracks were starting to form in her perfect illusion. One evening, while having dinner with Ben, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach twist. It was a message from Ethan. "Miss you. Can't wait to see you tonight." Victoria's hand shot out to silence the notification before Ben noticed, but his eyes were already on her. "Who's that?" Ben asked casually, sipping his wine. "Just work," she lied smoothly. "Some last-minute project I need to handle." Ben nodded, seemingly satisfied, but Victoria felt the weight of his gaze linger on her. For the first time, she wondered if he was beginning to suspect something. The first real sign of trouble came a week later. Victoria was at a coffee shop with Ethan, pretending to listen as he vented about a difficult bandmate. She was scanning the room out of habit, always alert, always cautious, when she saw a familiar face. Ben's coworker, Linda, was sitting 2 tables away, her sharp eyes locked on Victoria and Ethan. Panic shot through Victoria like ice water. Linda knew Ben, and if she recognized Victoria with another man, the house of cards she'd built could come crashing down. Thinking quickly, Victoria leaned into Ethan and whispered, "We need to leave. Now." Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. They left the coffee shop through the back door, and Victoria breathed a sigh of relief. But as they walked down the street, she couldn't shake the feeling that Linda had seen enough to start asking questions. That night, Victoria lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, she felt the weight of her double life pressing down on her. It wasn't guilt. She had long since buried any sense of guilt, but fear. If Linda said something to Ben, everything could unravel. And Ethan, well, Ethan wasn't the forgiving type. If he ever found out about Ben, his reaction would be unpredictable and possibly dangerous. Victoria told herself she had everything under control, but deep down, she knew the truth. She was playing a dangerous game, and it was only a matter of time before it all fell apart. As Victoria drifted off to sleep, she had no idea that the walls of her carefully constructed world were already starting to close in around her. In the shadows, suspicion was growing, and secrets were beginning to surface. The perfect illusion wouldn't last forever, and when it shattered, it would leave destruction in its wake. It was a Friday night, and Sophia was out with Daniel at a quiet Italian restaurant near her apartment. She sipped her wine, laughing at one of his stories about a disastrous client meeting. As the waiter brought their entrees, Sophia caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Her heart stopped when she saw Adrian walking past the restaurant window, glancing inside. Adrian froze, his eyes locking on hers through the glass. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face as he frowned, his gaze shifting to Daniel. Thinking quickly, she excused herself to the restroom, texting Adrian, "Work dinner. Don't come in. I'll call you later." Adrian's reply came almost immediately, "Who's the guy?" Sophia didn't respond. She returned to the table, forcing a smile as Daniel continued his story, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. The next day, Adrian confronted her. "That wasn't a work dinner," he said, pacing her living room. "Who is he, Sophia? Your boss? A client?" Sophia's mind raced for an excuse, but Adrian's tone softened before she could respond. "I just don't want to lose you," he said, his voice breaking. Sophia placed a hand on his cheek, guilt swirling in her chest. "You're not losing me," she said softly, even as her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Miss you already. Last night was perfect." Victoria thought she had perfected her double life, but the lies were starting to catch up with her. Every carefully planned story, every excuse, every false promise. It was all beginning to pile up like a fragile house of cards. The cracks were small at first, barely noticeable, but they were spreading. And like a spider's web, they were drawing her two lives dangerously close to colliding. Tea started with Ben. Over dinner one evening, as Victoria shared a half-hearted story about a stressful day at work, Ben seemed unusually quiet. He was always attentive, but tonight, his eyes lingered on her in a way that made her uneasy. "You've been working a lot lately," Ben said finally, his voice measured. Victoria felt her chest tighten. "You know how demanding my boss is," she said, smiling sweetly. "He's piling on projects now that the holidays are coming up." Ben nodded slowly, but the look on his face suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "I ran into Linda at the office today," he said, almost casually. The fork in Victoria's hand froze midair. "Oh?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "She said she saw you last week at that coffee shop downtown. Said you looked like you were in a hurry." Victoria's mind raced. So Linda had seen her with Ethan. She forced a laugh and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, right. I was meeting a client there. They're always running late, so I had to rush off to make my next meeting." Ben didn't press further, but Victoria could see the wheels turning in his mind. The seed of doubt had been planted. If Ben was suspicious, Ethan was downright impatient. He had always been possessive, but lately, his demands for Victoria's time had grown more intense. "You're always running off," Ethan said one night as they sat in his apartment. His guitar rested against the wall, abandoned for the night. "I feel like I never get enough of you." Victoria leaned into him, tracing her fingers along his jawline. "You know I'd stay forever if I could," she whispered, her voice dripping with honey. "But my job, it's demanding." Ethan pulled away slightly, his eyes narrowing. Is it just your job? Or is there something else you're not telling me? The question caught her off guard. She recovered quickly, planting a kiss on his lips to silence him. Don't be ridiculous, she murmured. But as Ethan pulled her closer, she could feel his tension. His grip was firmer than usual, and the look in his eyes told her that he wasn't entirely convinced either. Point one evening, as Victoria was finishing a late-night dinner with Ben, her phone buzzed on the table. She had turned off notifications from Ethan's messages long ago, but tonight she had made a crucial mistake. She had forgotten to put her phone on silent. Ben's eyes flicked to the screen before she could snatch it up. "Who's Ethan?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. Victoria felt her stomach drop. "Oh, he's just a co-worker," she said quickly. "We're working on a project together, and he keeps texting me with questions." Ben didn't say anything, but his expression darkened. He nodded, returning to his meal, but Victoria could feel the change in the air. That night, as Ben showered, she checked her phone. Ethan's message was short but accusatory. "Why aren't you answering me? Are you with someone else?" Her hands trembled as she typed a reply. "Busy. We'll call you later." The next day, Ethan showed up unannounced at Victoria's workplace. She was in the middle of a meeting when her assistant poked her head into the conference room. "There's a man here asking for you," she said hesitantly. "He says it's urgent." Victoria's heart sank. She excused herself and hurried to the lobby, where Ethan was pacing, his leather jacket slung over one shoulder. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, glancing around nervously. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice low and intense. "I feel like you're hiding something from me." "I told you. I'm at work," she said through gritted teeth. "This isn't the time or place." But Ethan wasn't backing down. "Who's Ben?" he asked suddenly, his eyes locking onto hers. Victoria froze. "What are you talking about?" she said, forcing a laugh. Ethan pulled his phone from his pocket and showed her a photo. Her stomach dropped as she recognized herself with Ben, walking hand in hand outside a restaurant. The photo was blurry, but there was no mistaking it. "Who sent you this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "A friend," Ethan said coolly. "So, are you going to tell me the truth, or am I going to find out some other way?" Victoria's mind raced. She couldn't let him confront Ben, but she also couldn't afford to let Ethan walk away angry. "Ethan, please." "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice pleading. "Just give me time to explain." Ethan stared at her for a long moment before nodding. "You've got until tomorrow," he said. "If you don't tell me everything, I'm done." That night, Victoria barely slept. Her world was spiraling out of control, and she could feel the walls closing in. She considered her options. Come clean to Ethan, lie to Ben, or try to string them both along a little longer. But the decision was taken out of her hands the next morning. As she sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. The message contained a single line. "They're both going to find out soon." Attached was a photo of Victoria, kissing Ethan outside his apartment. Her blood ran cold. Someone knew everything. And whoever it was, they were ready to blow her perfect illusion wide open. As Victoria left the house that morning, she felt as if everyone around her was watching. Her carefully constructed life was crumbling, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't the one in control anymore. Ben, Ethan, and now a third player she couldn't identify. It was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. And when it did, Victoria knew she wouldn't be the only one left in ruins. Adrian's patience began to wear thin. He started showing up unannounced at Sophia's place, often catching her as she was leaving to meet Daniel. Each time, Sophia smoothed things over with promises and sweet words. But Adrian wasn't buying it anymore. One evening, as Sophia was getting ready for a date with Daniel, Adrian showed up again. This time, he brought a gift, a bracelet he'd seen her admire weeks ago. "You're leaving again," he said, his tone sharp. "Who is he, Sophia? Don't lie to me this time." Sophia hesitated, and in that moment, Adrian's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then back at her, his expression darkening. "Who's Daniel?" he asked, holding up his phone. Sophia's blood ran cold. Adrian had followed her, taking a photo of her and Daniel at the park earlier that day. You've been lying to me this whole time, Adrian said, his voice rising. Before Sophia could respond, her phone rang. It was Daniel. Don't answer that, Adrian said, stepping closer. Sophia answered anyway, her voice trembling. Hi, Daniel. I think we need to talk, Daniel said. I know something's going on. Victoria's once carefully balanced double life was teetering on the edge of collapse, and she knew it. The anonymous messages had thrown her into a state of panic, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her every move. Worse, Ethan's patience was wearing thin, and Ben's suspicions were mounting. The pressure was suffocating, and it was only a matter of time before everything exploded. The first message had been unsettling, but the second was downright chilling. It arrived in the middle of the night, waking Victoria from a restless sleep. She blinked at the glowing screen of her phone, her heart pounding as she read, "You're running out of time, Victoria. They deserve to know the truth." Attached was a video. She hesitated before playing it, her stomach knotting with dread. The footage showed her entering Ethan's apartment, her arm linked with his. The timestamp in the corner revealed it was from last week. Her hand shook as she stared at the screen. Someone had been following her. Someone had been close enough to catch her in the act. But who? She deleted the video and sat in the dark for hours, trying to think. The only solution she could come up with was to distract both men until she could figure out who was behind the messages. The next morning, Ethan was waiting for her outside her workplace. He leaned against his car, his arms crossed and his face unreadable. "We need to talk," he said as soon as she stepped out of her car. Victoria forced a smile, hoping to defuse his obvious tension. "Ethan, I'm late for a meeting." "No more excuses," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "I gave you time to explain, and you didn't. Now you're going to tell me what's going on." Victoria glanced around nervously. A few co-workers were milling about in the parking lot, casting curious glances in their direction. She grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him toward a quieter corner. "Ethan, please," she whispered. "I've been under so much stress. Work, family, it's just a lot right now. I'm sorry if I've been distant, but it's not what you think." His jaw tightened. "Then make me understand. Who's the guy in the photo?" Victoria hesitated for a moment too long. Ethan's eyes darkened, and she knew she was losing him. Desperation crept into her voice as she lied. He's an old friend. We've been catching up, that's all." Ethan didn't look convinced. "You've got one last chance, Victoria. If I find out you're lying to me, we're done. No second chances." If dealing with Ethan was nerve-wracking, facing Ben that evening was even worse. Victoria walked into the house to find him sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand. He rarely drank, which was the first sign that something was wrong. "Hey," she said cautiously, setting down her bag. "Everything okay?" Ben gestured toward the couch. "Sit down. We need to talk." Victoria's heart sank. She perched on the edge of the cushion, trying to gauge his mood. "What's this about?" Ben set his glass down and fixed her with a steady gaze. "I know you're hiding something." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not blind, Victoria. You've been distant, distracted. You're always on your phone, and half the time, you're out late with some excuse about work. I've been giving you space, but now I need answers." Victoria felt the walls closing in. "Ben, you're overthinking this," she said, forcing a laugh. "Work has been crazy, that's all. You know how demanding my boss is." But Ben wasn't buying it. "If it's just work, then why did I find this?" He pulled out his phone and showed her a screenshot of a text message thread. Her blood ran cold as she recognized her own messages to Ethan. "How did you get that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben's face hardened. "I didn't. Someone sent it to me." Victoria's mind raced. Whoever was behind the messages wasn't just targeting her. They were manipulating everyone involved. The realization made her blood boil. "Ben, I don't know who sent that to you, but they're trying to ruin us," she said, her voice trembling with feigned sincerity. "Who's E?" he demanded, ignoring her attempt to deflect. "And don't lie to me, Victoria." She hesitated, knowing she was out of options. Finally, she said, "He's a co-worker. We've been working on a big project. and sometimes things get personal, but it's nothing serious. Ben's expression didn't soften. I don't believe you. The following day, everything came to a head. Victoria received a text from the unknown number instructing her to meet at a local cafe that evening. The message was clear. Bring Ben and Ethan. It's time. She tried to ignore it, but another text followed minutes later. If you don't show, they'll find out anyway. Her hands trembled as she texted both men, asking them to meet her at the cafe. She told herself she could spin the situation, somehow salvage her tangled web of lies. But when she arrived, she saw them both sitting at separate tables, each looking confused and increasingly angry as they realized what was happening. Before Victoria could explain, the cafe's TV screens flickered and a video began to play. It was footage of her with Ethan, followed by footage of her with Ben. The room fell silent as everyone watched her betrayals unfold in vivid detail. Ben stood abruptly, his face a mask of rage and betrayal. Was any of it real? He demanded, his voice shaking. Ethan, equally furious, turned to Victoria. You lied to both of us. Who the hell are you? Victoria's carefully constructed world crumbled in an instant. As the cafe patrons whispered and stared, she realized there was no way out this time. When the video ended, a man stepped forward from the back of the cafe, a man Victoria didn't recognize. He held up a phone, a smug smile on his face. Looks like the game's over, sweetheart, he said. You really should be more careful who you mess with. Victoria's blood ran cold as she realized he was the one behind the messages. But before she could confront him, Ben and Ethan walked out, leaving her standing alone in the wreckage of her lies. And as the strangers in the cafe turned back to their meals, Victoria knew she had no one to blame but herself. In the aftermath of the confrontation, neither man could look at her the same way. Adrian left first, shaking his head in disgust. Daniel lingered, staring at Sophia with a mix of hurt and anger. I loved you, he said quietly, before turning and walking away. Sophia was left standing alone, the weight of her actions sinking in. She played them both, and now she had nothing. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, Sophia received an anonymous text. Thought you should know. Adrian and Daniel have been talking. They know everything. Sophia felt a chill as she read the final message. You're not the only one who knows how to play games. Her carefully built life crumbled as whispers of her deceit spread through her social circles and workplace. By the time it was over, Sophia wasn't just alone. She was a pariah. The men had walked away, but they'd left her with the wreckage of her own making.